I've received a lot of requests to make katanas or machetes and other swords, and I've always wondered why. Just go buy a cheap one, it's easy. Because, you idiot, you can't take a metal blade onto the con floor. Yeah, all right, yeah, okay, that makes sense. Hello, I'm Odin, and today I'm going to do something a little different. I'm going to make 3 very different swords. I'm going to make a katana, I'm going to make a fantasy medieval sword, and I'm going to make a machete. And these are all going to be con-friendly. They're going to be made of foam. Because what else do I do? My first concern with making a foam sword is that it doesn't flop about, because what fun is that? Unless, of course, that's what you're going for. But I'm not. I want what looks like a metal sword, but made out of foam, so you can actually take it into a con. What I've done in the past, in order to make this work out, is to actually use PVC pipe as a stiffener. Now, this is an old thing that goes back to Boffers, but that always makes a really thick blade, which worked out well for the fusion sword, but that's not what I'm after when I want to make a sword that looks right to go with my cosplay. So my thought was, instead of the big thick PVC pipe, I'm just going to use a golf club. What I want are graphite shaft golf clubs, not metal. I have been able to find graphite golf clubs in thrift stores for as little as $1. Now, you could use carbon fiber tubes, but golf clubs are way cheaper. I only want the graphite part, so I cut off the head with my bandsaw. A jigsaw will work, and a hacksaw did the job too. And no matter how you cut it off, make sure to sand the cut edges smooth. I also didn't want the rubber grip, so I removed that too, and I cleaned up the tape that was underneath the grip. The graphite shaft is thin enough that it can fit between just 2 layers of foam, but you'll need to cut a channel for it to fit in. My first idea was to fold over the foam and use a razor knife to cut off most of the folded bump. Then, when you laid it back flat, you get a channel for the golf club to lay in. And this actually works. Now, it wasn't too hard to do, but you can only really get one good cut on the fold. A second cut usually cuts all the way through the foam and makes a hole. Also, it's better to clamp between rulers or pieces of wood so you don't mark your foam with the spring clamps. An easier method was to use a Dremel or other rotary tool. I use a piece of wood as a guide to make a straight line, and I was able to make more than one pass to get the channel deep enough, but it was still pretty easy to cut all the way through the foam. The blade I want to make is longer than the foam, so I cut 2 strips of floor mat from end to end, and on a third piece, I left a spot without a channel. This is where I cut it in half, and this will be the tip of the sword. I made my seam line staggered to avoid weak spots, and cut a little off the longer side and made them equal. The bit of golf club that sticks out will be the grip of the sword. I use contact cement to glue together the foam and glue in the graphite shaft. With all 3 swords, I had some buckling and bulges on the foam from the contact cement sticking to the shaft incorrectly. Next time, I'm going to use hot glue on the graphite shaft and only use contact cement to glue the foam together. I decided to use a toy plastic katana for the Suka and the Suba. They're going to look fine, and this will speed up the build a lot. I cut the toy plastic blade off and drilled out the Suka so the graphite rod will fit. I didn't center the rod placement. My plan is to curve the foam blade shape around the straight rod, so the rod needs to sit off-center on the handle. Next, I drew the shape of the blade that I wanted on the foam graphite sandwich and cut it out with a razor knife. You notice that I left the texture on the outside. I will just sand it all off and get a really clean seam on the blade edge. Now, I could sand the whole thing with a disc sander, but that sander really makes a fuzzy surface to the foam. So I tried the belt sander instead. This did everything I wanted. It removed the foam texture and beveled the edge to make the blade. Now, I only had a 60 grit belt, and it left a rough linear texture on the foam, but it removed everything in a hurry. Now, if I wasn't careful, I could quickly gouge the edges of the blade or sand a part of myself. I need to add finer grit sanding belts to my shopping list. I found it easiest to make the cutting edge of the sword by pushing the foam into the curve of the belt and watching where the glue seam was for my cutting edge. I sanded both the katana and the fantasy sword at the same time, pushing the main cut edge and dragging to sharpen the tip. The assembly of the fantasy medieval blade is identical to what I just showed you for the katana, except that I had hand cut all the channels of the golf club with a razor knife. Now, if you watch the blade, you can see where I cut through the foam on accident. And instead of starting over, I thought I would just finish it and see how it turned out. With the blade sharpened, I can add the blade collar to the katana. This is just a piece of 2mm craft foam wrapped around and sanded to make it look a little nicer. And that completes the build for this simple katana. To make the pommel of the medieval sword, I glued 2 layers of foam together and used a hole saw to make a 2-inch disc. Then I cut out a hole for the golf club to fit in and wrapped the outside with 5mm craft foam to finish it off. To make the crossguard of the medieval sword, I used the puzzle edges from the foam mats. They have a good curve to them, and they'll be perfect. I cut 4 of them to fit, sanded the texture off, and I will glue them at the base of the blade. I cut a piece of PEX pipe to add to the handle so it's a more comfortable size. I wrap painter's tape around the graphite rod until the PEX is a snug fit, and then I can use hot glue to hold it in place. Hot glue the pommel on to finish the build. I'm going to spray Plasti Dip on all of the swords, but Plasti Dip will not stick to the plastic PEX pipe, so I just put painter's tape on the grip, and that's the build for this sword. Lastly, I wanted to make a machete. It's a great tool for trimming back overgrowth and landscaping, and a favorite tool for hacking up teenage campers. My plan was to cut each half from a single floor mat, and I made a basic pattern, well, it's a sketch really, on paper to make sure that I liked it. And I cut a match set from foam and added the channel for the golf club, making sure I didn't fully cut from end to end. And I added a mark where the tube sits so I know where not to cut later. Then I trimmed down the golf club to fit the channel and sanded the end. With a liberal amount of contact cement, I glued all 3 pieces together. Oh, look at that. That's a huge bulge and ugly. Then I cut out the shape with a razor knife, and I cut too close to the golf club on the tip of the blade. There it is. But it's not that big of a deal. I just re-glue the bad cut, adjust for my second try, and it's ready for the sander. First I remove the texture, and then push the blade through to sharpen it. And it's a bit tricky sharpening a curve like the one on the end, but I got it to work. I'm definitely getting a lighter grit sanding belt in the future. I want to add a couple of pieces of 5mm foam to bulk up the handle, and after gluing them on, I use a grinding stone in the Dremel to round the grip into a good shape, and I use the indent on the end of the grinding stone to make rivets in the handle. So I've made a machete, I've got a katana, and a fantasy sword. All I want to do now is take these outside and paint them. Everything gets a full coat of Plasti Dip spray. Plasti Dip will create a flexible base coat and smooth out the foam texture. Next, I spray paint everything with a bright silver. I want to knock down the super silver color of the medieval sword and the machete, so I lightly mist them with a flat black spray paint, holding the can a little further away than normal and not fully pressing on the nozzle. With each blade painted its own silver, I paint the blade collar gold on the katana and hot glue the tsuba and the suka in place. And that's it for katana. We'll call it finished. On the medieval sword, I remove the painter's tape from the handle and wrap it with black hockey tape. I could do more, but today I'm keeping it simple. I thin down some black craft paint with water and add a black wash to the sword. And this adds a darker weathered look. I paint the handle in the machete brown, then heavily black wash the handle and the blade. On the blade, I concentrate the black wash at the base where it meets the handle, and then pull the paint out towards the tip to try to make kind of a gradient of black. I also never add any black wash on the sharp edge. I paint the rivets silver and add a random wrap of hockey tape to the handle. Both the machete and the medieval swords are sealed with clear coat to protect the black wash. Everything I used to make all 3 of these swords were picked up locally, and I put a part list in the description. And there we have 3 very different swords made pretty much the same way, and they are con safe. Just those few hits, it's wrinkled. Pretty badly, actually. Yep, it worked. It relaxed the foam and they came out. Now, there's going to be lots of different ways that you can make a foam sword, but this is how Odin makes. I now have a Patreon page, which will give you the chance to win props that are made right here in Odin Makes. And it's the only place where I'll talk about my upcoming builds. If you like the video or have ideas or something for me to make, please leave them in the comments below. And if you make any of these projects, you can send me a picture.
Who are you and what are you doing here?
I'm something different, and today I'm gonna Odin.